Okay. And now we're going to be talking about looking forward, how the decision aid might apply to future studies. And we'll begin with Dr. CATHY Critchlow from Amgen.
So I'm CATHY Critchlow. I'm coming from the perspective of an evidence producer, if you will, within the within Amgen, within the pharmaceutical industry. And for us, it's really a question of we're working with the teams that they're making decisions based on taking a drug to approval, and we're working with the value teams, we're working with the safety teams, we're working with the medical affairs teams. And at the risk of sounding like a methods nerd, our role is really to help those teams make the right decision. So in the, back to a question that's been made all morning, it's, well, we really have to start with the right question. Are we trying to answer a question about effectiveness? And is that a point estimate of effectiveness? Is that what is the whole strategy of effectiveness in the context of how a drug is actually used in the right setting? Is it what's the context? Is it are we trying to impact or inform treatment guidelines? Are we trying to both talk about trying to bring a drug for new approval or label expansion? So again, what's the context? Are we in the right population? Are we having the right population to answer the question appropriately? And then what's the consequence of getting the wrong answer? So in that sense, it's a trade-off. So when we talk about blinding in the sense of how likely are we to get the right or the wrong answer depending on those decisions that were made. So when you take a step back and you have a study and you come up with a study finding, a result, there's one of three things that can happen. One is that the observed association or point estimate or whatever our outcome is, it's real. And then in that case, we talk about wanting to infer causality. It's observed by chance, and that's where the whole statistical testing and p-values comes in. Or it's spurious. And it can be spurious for a number of reasons, one of which is we can, in the context of this discussion, blinding. So when we take a step back and we talk about is blinding the right or the wrong way to look at that, you have to think about it in the context of, is it helping us make the right decision? Is it helping us answer the right question in the right population that we've been hearing about? So what are the kinds of biases that blinding or failure to blind might generate? So we can think about, the ones that come immediately to mind are, selection bias. You get the wrong patient population enrolled. You have ascertainment bias. You have inadequate or incorrect assessment of an outcome. You can also think about the validity or the fidelity of the comparisons that you're making. So was the drug administered as intended? Was patient adherence sufficient to get the intended outcome? So when we think about trying to put this decision aid into context, as I looked at it, it really was trying to put helping teams answer questions about, well, how likely are we to come up with some of these biases that blinding or failure to blind might engender. So as Jonathan walked through the different questions, and my take on it was the first one is really getting at, do patients and providers feel that there's equipoise? So what are the risks and benefits of participating? And do people feel good about, if they know what they're getting or not know what they're getting, do they feel like there's equipoise there? The second one kind of was the intervention administered as intended? So how do patients' perceptions and whatever impact their likelihood of complying with a treatment regimen as it was intended? The third question to me spoke to, well, do we have the right patient population? What's the external validity? It can be generalized to the target population that we're trying to generalize to. The fourth one had to do with ascertainment bias. So how do people's perceptions help guide, are you getting the right assessment of endpoints? So in that sense, when we think about blinding of or masking of you could talk about the providers, the patients, but also about assessors. So who is making the interpretation of whether an endpoint was achieved? So I'm sure we'll get into discussion in these trials. Well, if it's something that's very objective, the assessors don't need to be blinded. But in other areas where the assessors are not blinded and it's not as objective as possible, then there is potential there. The fifth one in this particular decision aid had to do with, what's the likelihood of attenuation toward the null, if you will, by having crossover between treatment arms. So when you think about what's the potential impact of that, as you see as in a particular trial. And the last one had to do with, well, how feasible? So blinding, does it introduce issues that impact the feasibility of conducting the trial, whether it's recruiting patients, whether it's cost, whether it's perceptions of equipoise. So again, to paraphrase, things that Greg has been saying, it really does depend on where in this milieu one finds yourself. So again, just backing up is, as we've stepped through that, are we answering the right question? Are we applying it to the right population? And what's the likelihood that blinding or failure to blind or decision not to blind led to the wrong answer? And there it comes down to, well, what's the impact of each of those, as you answer those questions, what's the likelihood of a particular bias being introduced? What's the potential impact of that bias being introduced? And then what's the impact on the final decision made based on the data obtained?